you don't know, Will started a company called Maxis, I think back in 89. Good. The company IPO'd in 95 and was acquired, I was born a year before that, and was acquired in 97 by EA. And then in year 2000, Will published The Sims, which was the best-selling PC game in the history of the world. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, Will Wright.
Well, hi everybody. This is a strange event. I've never been on this before. It kind of feels like cross between a comedy club and an intervention. I kept asking everybody what I was supposed to do, and they said, just come and talk, and they didn't really say what to talk about. So I'm not quite sure if you want to hear like the history of my business world or random stuff, so I'll probably just kind of give you a brief background from my point of view, and then mainly open it to Q&A, because I feel much more comfortable with like kind of a back and forth interaction here. But kind of, let's see, where do I start? I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Spent most of my childhood building models, you know, tanks, ships, planes. I just loved these things. Got very interested in history, kind of along the way. At some point, I started like putting little, you know, motors in my tanks and learning about electricity, mechanics, and that kind of evolved into robotics. And that became kind of a lifelong passion for me. You know, even through my whole computer game career, I always carved out a lot of time to kind of build robots on the side and got involved with things like Robot Wars and BattleBots. But around 1980, the first PCs were coming out. The first Apple II I bought was actually to connect to these robots I was building. I was building robots out of spare parts and hydraulics and all these things. But so I bought an Apple II and basically learned how to, you know, program it and interface it, and learn electrically how to kind of interface it with hardware and stuff like that. And at that time, the very first computer games were coming out. I was living in New York City at the time, going to the new school. And there was one store, one computer store in New York City, an Apple store, that sold some of the very earliest computer games in little Ziploc bags. And going into the Apple store to buy, you know, components for my computer, I saw these little games. And I loved games as a kid. And so I just started buying a couple of these. You know, the very first one I bought was the very original Flight Simulator by Bruce Artwork. This was way before Microsoft bought it. And it was all wireframe graphics. And you open it up, and the instruction manual, the first thing it tells you is how to write a little machine code loader program to actually boot up the game. And so you have to drop into the monitor on the Apple II and write machine code just to get the game to start. But that's kind of the state at which the industry was. And there was no industry. I mean, this is a hobbyist, you know, very fringe thing. It never occurred to me this would turn into an industry. But I got sucked into these worlds, you know. Just even the simple, this is all wireframe graphics, incredibly primitive flight simulator, but it was a little tiny toy world with consistent physics that you could go around and explore and do things in. And that just absolutely fascinated me. So for the first time I realized that I could build models on the computer that were dynamic and had kind of behavior, as opposed to static models that were just kind of plastic sitting on the shelf. So I just kind of got sucked into this whole thing. And you know, the computer, this little plastic thing on my desk that was about half a cubic foot, was like a whole city, you know, just in terms of the complexity. And you know, once you really understood the way the address bus and the CPU and all these things were interacting. And I think, you know, the Apple II, the very first one, was almost to the scale to where one person could pretty much understand every aspect of that machine architecturally. And when I look at computers today, there's no way any one person could fully understand the operation of one of these things. But back then, it was just possible to kind of grasp the whole thing. But so I found myself just sucked into this, and pretty soon I was spending my, you know, all my time playing computer games and studying them and learning to program. And so almost more than anything else, I thought, you know, I could probably make one of these things, and then at least all the games I bought would be tax deductible. And so I never really thought about this as a career, you know, especially growing up, because these things didn't exist. But so around that time I really thought, okay, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try and design a game and program it. But at that point there were, you know, about 20 hardcore game designers on the Apple II that really knew that machine inside and out. And I thought it would be more of a level playing field if I bought this new computer that was just coming to the market called the Commodore 64. And so I bought one of those like the day it was released and just totally tore into it, you know, and just, you know, read everything I could, started programming on it, etc. And I did my first game on the Commodore 64. It was a game way back called Raid on Bungling Bay. And it was a pretty stupid game where you fly around and you bomb these islands with a helicopter. And, but, you know, I was actually using a lot of the hardware features of the Commodore, which, you know, were much more advanced than the Apple was. And so it was a pretty cool looking game. And I went, at that point, I moved to California. And there were about maybe 4 software companies at that point in the Bay Area. I think Broderbund Software, and I can't remember the other 3. But I went around and showed it to all 4, met the people. Actually, Electronic Arts I showed it to, even right when we were starting. And I met the people at Broderbund, and they were just really nice people. Doug and Gary Carlston were the brothers that started it. And we just kind of really hit it off. And so I ended up doing my first game with them as a publisher. And I was basically working independently at home, so sitting in my basement programming this game and going into Broderbund about once a week. And at that point, Broderbund Software was about 17 people, and they were in a liquor store in San Rafael. And in the back of the liquor store was actually the freezer where the programmers worked. It was actually the big freezer door, and they liked it back there because it was all dark. Of course, they turned off the refrigerator, thankfully. But so even back then, all the game companies were very, very small. And but at the same time, on the Commodore market in the U.S., there was a lot of piracy. That was always kind of a give and take in the game industry, is how much piracy was affecting us. And to give you some sense of the scope of the piracy, when we released Raid on Bungling Bay on the Commodore in the U.S. market, we sold about 20,000 copies, which was pretty good. It wasn't great. But almost everybody had played it. Almost everybody had a copy of it. The same game released in Japan on the Nintendo. It was one of the very first American games released in the Japanese market. And the Nintendo was a cartridge-based system. So there was really no effective piracy on that system. And in Japan, it sold 1 million units into a smaller market. About the same kind of number of base platforms out there. So that's about the scope of piracy that we were dealing with in the early 80s. And this is around 1984 that it released. But while I was working on Bungling Bay, one of the parts of it is I had to create this world with these little islands that you were flying over. And I built an editor that let me scroll around this much larger playing field and place down islands and roads and buildings. And I found while I was working on that game that I really enjoyed constructing these little worlds much more than I enjoyed bombing them. And so after I finished Bungling Bay, I kind of kept playing with that editor, and I started thinking it would be cool if I could actually get some simulation in this. I wanted to have traffic patterns and people moving and buildings going up and down and stuff like that. And so basically that editor from Bungling Bay directly evolved into what later became known as SimCity. And that was something that I was kind of programming, just kind of on my own. I was working as a freelance programmer at the time. Even with Broderbund, I never was an employee. I was just working at home. And a friend of ours kind of had this thing that he would do, kind of like this almost, except on a much smaller scale in Alameda back in the mid-'80s. His name was Chris Donner. And we'd have these pizza parties, and we'd have people that were in kind of entrepreneurship or tech or programming get together about once a month, and we could just kind of compare ideas and notes what we were doing. And that's where I met my eventual business partner, Jeff Braun, at one of these parties. And I showed him this little game that I was working on, which would later become SimCity. I was calling it City Planner 1.0, which wasn't quite as good a title. But anyway, Jeff had just done a little company on the Amiga where he had done font editing software, which kind of bored him to tears. And he thought he wanted to get into games. And he saw this game, and we said, hey, let's make a game company. Okay, how hard can it be? So that was basically how Maxis started. It was me meeting Jeff at an event very much like this. And so we hired a few programmers. At that point, like some of the newer computers were coming up, the next generation computers, the Macintosh, the IBM PC, etc. And we decided that we would reprogram SimCity for these computers. And so then we redesigned it for the Macintosh and the Amiga at that point, and a little bit later the IBM PC. And that's when we actually started Maxis. We're still running this basically out of Jeff's apartment at this point, and we had about 4 employees. And back then they had this big computer show out here called the West Coast Computer Fair. And that was kind of like CES became almost. A really old show, but it was kind of really cool, geeky, all very PC-centric. And I remember us going there, we had printed out some flyers, and we were just finishing up the game. And we went around, kind of dropping flyers on other people's tables, because we couldn't afford a table at the West Coast Computer Fair. And we started getting some early buzz on it. And we'd actually gotten Broderbund to sign up as the distributor. So they were the ones actually, bringing it to the stores and distributing it for us into retail. And at that point, it was very much, we had pretty much poured all of our money into this company. And it had gotten to the point where basically we had 60 days for Broderbund to pay us, but we had to pay the people building the game and printing out, the floppy disks and the manuals and all that ahead of time. So we gave Broderbund, a few more points off of our cut if they would bring the terms in. So basically we got to the point where Broderbund paid us the money and we just handed it to the people building the game who shipped it back to Broderbund. But it was that tight. We didn't have the money to actually invest in the inventory at the time. But through just wheeling and dealing, we kind of managed to make those ends meet and got our first shipment of SimCity out there. And one of the, we had a lot of lucky accidents that happened. One of the lucky accidents was that at that time I was just totally enamored with the Macintosh, the very early black and white Macintosh. And so all of my programming, I insisted on doing it on the Macintosh. And at that point, there were a lot of games coming out on the IBM PC, but very few on the Macintosh. But it turns out that all the journalists had Macintosh. Almost none of them had IBM PCs. And so the fact that an interesting Macintosh game came out means that we got tremendously more press relative to the market than we would have gotten otherwise. And so actually the very first computer game reviewed in Time magazine was SimCity. And it was because the journalist reviewing it had a Macintosh, and this was about the only game you could buy to play on it. So, but that was kind of one of our big breaks. Up to then, it was just kind of word of mouth. We were like fighting to get our game into stores and stuff like that. But after this article came out in Time, then it was just kind of downhill. Well, uphill actually, depending on how you look at it. But it was also interesting because at that point in time, the games market was very much, when you came out with a game, all of your sales were pretty much in the first 3 months. And you get this giant peak, and then it would trail off very, very, rapidly. And 6 months, a year later, you weren't selling anything. SimCity came out early in the year, and our sales were ramping all the way up to Christmas, where it got, very high compared to what we thought it would. And then it kind of tapered off a bit, but then we actually sold more the second Christmas than we did the first Christmas, and even more the third Christmas. So we were actually seeing higher sales on a year-on-year basis, and we were having this title on the shelf for, like 4 or 5 years, effectively, which was kind of unheard of in the game industry. So that paid for a lot of mistakes, and we made plenty of mistakes. We're basically growing this company. We don't know what we're doing. We finally get our first office in Moraga, and we have about 20 people. We eventually moved to Orinda. We started doing other sim games, etc. And just kind of speed things up, we basically released more sim games. Most of them did not do as well as SimCity, but they did okay. We did like Sim Earth, Sim Ant. We learned a lot in terms of marketing, but we were also growing the company very rapidly. And around 50 people or so, and this is something that, if you've ever been in a startup and seen it grow, there's a tremendous disruption that happens when you go from about 20, 25 people to about 50. There are a couple of like valleys of death like that happen in the growth of the company. I think one's between about 20 and 50 people. Another one is kind of between 50 and 100. That the fundamental character of the way your company is organized, just has to be torn apart and rebuilt, basically from the ground up. So I feel really lucky that we managed to survive these, because I remember going through these processes, at some point we had to add reporting structures and things like that, and performance reviews, and all these things that we just never thought about. We were just making games, right? And we were a little out of our league, I think, on the business side, and we were doing okay financially for the time being, but that's exactly when we decided to bring in venture capital. We didn't really need it at the time. At that point, we had plenty of income, but it was more because we felt like we needed adult supervision. We really just did not know what we were doing. And so we actually had this company in New York, Will Wright came in. They put $10 million into our company, bought about 30% of it. For Warburg Pincus, this was by far and away the smallest investment they'd ever made in any single company. They're not like a kind of early stage VC company at all. They're more of a blue chip New York VC firm. And the only reason they invested in this was because the managing director, Bill Janeway, had a 5-year-old son, who was also totally getting into games. And so this made him the big hero that he was, working with a game company. But as a result, we got these very high-powered executives on our board coming in and giving us, a really different insight into kind of the way business works. And of course, we were also putting ourselves on a path to liquidity, which was pretty much the standard path at that time. Whenever you have a tech startup, it pretty much you're eventually going to do an IPO, go public, et cetera, et cetera. Which we did. We went down that path, and we kind of went public, and our stock went up, and then it went down. And at the same time, the industry was consolidating very rapidly. And so there were a lot of very large companies and a lot of very small developers, and just a few kind of mid-tier companies. And we were in that mid-tier kind of uncomfortably. We actually had, at that point, 5 offices. We had a sales office and a development office in Tokyo. We had a sales office in London. We had a development studio in Austin, one in Salt Lake City. And we had a sales staff at that point because we were working directly with the distributors at that point. But we didn't really have enough stuff in the pipeline to keep the sales staff busy. So I think we were a little heavy on the sales side. But for all these reasons, it became pretty apparent with the market conditions that we wanted to be acquired by one of the larger companies. And we actually started talking to several companies, Activision, Electronic Arts, and Infogrames at the time. And they came in and looked at what we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually we ended up going with EA, which I think, in retrospect, was really the right decision compared to the trajectories of the other companies. What was interesting about EA when they came in, and there's a whole other story, which was that around that time I was actually starting to work on The Sims, and I'd been working on The Sims internally for a couple of years at that point. But oddly enough, I was getting no traction internally with the people at Maxis on The Sims. Just nobody got it. Even the board of directors, all the other executives at Maxis thought it was a waste of time, and who wants to play a game where you're taking out the trash and stuff like that. But oddly enough, when the people from EA came in and they were doing the due diligence on the company, I showed it to a couple of them, and they got it. And so as soon as EA acquired Maxis, all of a sudden I went from having this little black ops project with 4 programmers that I had stolen from their projects to basically getting whatever I needed on the project. And I think from EA's point of view, the other companies, when they were evaluating Maxis, in terms of the value of it, it was all about SimCity. What is that franchise worth? How much can they milk SimCity over time? I think for EA, they came in and said, okay, this is an engine that can develop new franchises, and we think The Sims is going to be the next big franchise developed in the studio. And I think they were very correct. And it was that attitude that actually kind of brought The Sims to market and made it do so well. And another big part of this that I thought was interesting was that at the time, EA had gotten very large. They'd been around for quite a while. And there were some very bright up-and-coming stars in EA that were getting basically kind of sick and tired of a lot of the red tape and the bureaucracy within this large company. And they were the ones that basically wanted to jump ship. But instead of leaving EA, what they wanted to do was jump ship to Maxis, which is in a separate location. And they felt like that was a place where they would have a lot of creative latitude. And in particular, people like Luke Bartlett, Lucy Bradshaw, and a few others became in as basically the directors running Maxis, which is now a division of Electronic Arts. And they were able, these were very bright, very competent people, they were able to come in and do things that they probably could not have done in the regular organization that they were coming from. So I think that there was a lot of value that came in. So I think that acquisition worked out very well. And I think it was pretty good timing for us for doing that acquisition, because I don't think we would have survived in the open market otherwise. But to kind of wrap up, so I worked with Electronic Arts as a designer for several years. Did Sims, several other kind of Sims expansion packs, Sims Online, Spore most recently, and just about a year ago, almost exactly, left EA to found a new startup, which for me is the really the second startup I've done, the Stupid Fun Club, and. It was actually nice because Electronic Arts is a minority investor in it. But yet I managed to get a deal from Electronic Arts that did not require me to put the company on a path to liquidity. Because I'd kind of been through that whole roller coaster and seen what happened. And I felt like there was a lot of dysfunction when you connect your company to Wall Street, especially recently. The kind of decisions that it drives, after you go through an IPO and you're a public company, you almost have to experience to get a sense of how dysfunctional that can be. And I'm not saying that it can't be done right. I'm just saying that it requires a huge amount of experience and effort to kind of navigate those straits correctly. So when I started this new thing, the Stupid Fun Club, I had in my mind a very specific structure I wanted for building a company that was going to be sustainable and not necessarily be on this path to kind of exponential growth. Because when you go, even towards an IPO, people are looking for this certain kind of ramp of, gross on sales, revenue, et cetera, year on year. And I was trying to actually build something here now that is sustainable long term. And in fact, I don't want the headcount in the Stupid Fun Club to ever go above like 25 people. And I want something where there's a kind of a balanced work-life balance. There's kind of a business balance in terms of what's doable, what our budget is, et cetera. But I could go on and on about that. So. Oh, yes, Stuart. No, I don't mean to be unselling you from Stuart here. No, that's not my intention at all.
No, I know, because you don't want to talk to these guys about life balance, for Christ's sake.
No, not yet.
You want these guys to work 20 hours a day.
Well, for 10 years you can do that. This is actually a very important point that I've seen so many people come and go in the game industry. They come in, they work their butt off for one project, and then they burn out. The crunch mode, that last 10% will kill you if you don't approach it properly. And I've seen probably, of all the people coming into the game industry, 30% of the people have left the game industry after one project because of that. And a lot of these were very bright, very competent people that if they just back off about 1 or 2 notches, that would have been a survivable experience for them. And the next project, they would have probably struck that balance more correctly, and then they would have been a career game industry.
So aside from yourself, Will, who would you recommend that these guys go look at and study as sort of icons of game development? Maybe we could mention Bill Budge and people like that, but who are the people that you would consider, aside from Will Wright, are also inspirational game developers?
Well, if you look at like my generation of game developers,
because these are kids, they gotta find models for.
Right, but they're growing up in a different ecosystem than I did.
Yeah.
I think the world right now, if I started out in game development, I'll wrap myself here. It's a totally different world than when I started, which was no industry at all. And people like myself, Sid Meier, Peter Molyneux, that I very much respect and enjoy their games. I mean, we all basically learned through the School of Hard Knocks. You know, there was no design curriculums at any university teaching this stuff. I'd say that actually the most inspiration I've found has come from outside the game industry. From other designers, totally outside the game design field. And I spent a lot of my career studying other design fields because I think there are a lot of lessons. When you look at game design is multidimensional in a really interesting way. When you consider all the aspects that go into game design, you have aspects of product design, architecture, cognitive psychology, fine art. I think in some sense, game design is possibly the broadest design field there is. Because almost any other design field I can think of bears on game design. And you know, I've spent time looking at things like, you know, Japanese gardens, architecture, instructional design. You know, all these things have tremendous lessons that can be applied to game design. And so I've spent a lot of time, I'd say that my larger kind of icons would be people like Charles Ray Eames, the American designers, or Christopher Alexander, people like that.
So I have a bunch of questions I'd like to ask you, but they're probably totally irrelevant to most of these guys here. So here's a key thing. What do you think of Zynga and all this kind of social gaming stuff? Who was the guy that stood up
Facebook
here
games, yes.
that said he's doing real games on Facebook? And
Yeah.
Don't.
I didn't mean it derisively, though.
Don't derisively. That's interesting. Derisively. Yeah, but you know, there's this people sneer at Facebook games, and you know they're not real games. And what do you think of that?
I mean, Facebook is one, I think it's very definitely a platform now. And it's maybe a secondary platform, almost in the way, like 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, what about all these people doing games on the internet?
Yeah.
Okay, you know, right now we call it Facebook, but I think, you know, it's going to kind of diffuse and continue to be ubiquitous. It's going to become more ubiquitous than it currently is. But this idea that it's not just the internet connecting computers together, but we have social platforms connecting people together, which are now platforms that you can play games on. I think that's definitely going to be around for a long, long time, and I think it's going to grow. I don't think it's going to subsume all the other markets. You know, about 10 years, or maybe 15 years ago, people were always talking about, you know, multiplayer gaming and how pretty soon every game is going to be multiplayer, and you know, that's all there's going to be. But no, we still have little games on our iPhones. We have single-player games on our consoles and PCs. It's going to become a major part of the market. I think that these social network games, in some sense, will probably end up being maybe 25% of the market. What's interesting about them is that they're great kind of gateway drugs. They bring a lot of people into gaming that otherwise would be very intimidated. You know, in some sense, gaming was in danger of closing off new members because the games were getting more elaborate.
Complex.
Yeah, and if I haven't played, you know, Counter-Strike 1 or, you know, something Doom, then when I get to Counter-Strike 7,
5 levels deep.
yeah, I'm totally lost. You know, and so for some people, World of Warcraft is kind of like that, but other people that have kind of grown up with those games, it's perfectly natural. And that's true of almost any media. I mean, look at books. There's certain books that you just don't want to start with. Other ones that are very light reading. But now, I think that we had this chicken and egg problem in gaming where basically there were no games for girls or for a wider demographic because the only people playing games were 15-year-old boys. Therefore, the only games made were those that catered to the 15-year-old boys. But I think we're now breaking out of that kind of vicious cycle, which is great. And I think that we had a lot to do with it. You know, for the first time we had people in retirement homes playing computers, you know, playing video games.
And old people.
Yeah.
So second question, and I don't mean to preempt everybody, but I used to do this for a living, asking questions, so it's natural. And,
So I have to pay you for this?
no, you don't. And so I'm trying to impress these guys, so they'll come to us first for money.
Oh, I see.
We're the only venture capitalists here, it turns out.
All right.
So I'm really interested to know, you know, now that Spore is out and you spent such a good portion of your life working on Spore, what do you think of what happened with Spore? And you know, is that a good thing that you spent your life on? And you know, talk about that. Talk about the experience of doing Spore.
Okay. Spore actually I spent like probably 7 years from the very beginning. And probably the first 2 years of just me researching, and you know, it was a massive project. And it wasn't as big a hit as The Sims by far. It still did quite respectfully. It sold, you know, many millions of units.
Right.
So easily paid for, you know, itself. But in some sense, I think Spore had some interesting successes and failures. You know, I think on the marketing side, we had some really spectacular failures. There was this whole VRM fiasco that happened right when we launched it, which was, and that's a whole different kind of conversational topic, you know, about how you manage stuff like that. On the game design side, the game could have definitely been deeper. We were actually much more concerned with it being more accessible to a wider group of people, because I had always seen the creative experience in Spore as being the paramount side of it, and I wanted people to be able to come in and make stuff very creatively. And almost the game was meant to be kind of a place to play with the toys that you had made and the tools. We saw a lot of unexpected successes in terms of people playing it that we never would have guessed. It was actually a big hit with 3-year-olds, as it turns out.
3-year-olds?
Yes. What would happen is a parent would have they download the creature creator or something, and the 3-year-old would sit on their lap, and they would say, give it 5 legs, give it 2 heads, and the parent would sit there and create this creature that would come to life, and the little kid would be delighted. So the parent basically had the hand-to-eye coordination to operate the computer, whereas the kid had the imagination to think of something interesting. And the two together, became just a great pairing. Because the parent would never think to do stupid stuff or crazy stuff like that. It was a 3-year-old, of course. But they would both enjoy it tremendously, But also, I think we had a lot of success on the social integration. There were a lot of aspects of Spore where you would create content, it would track who made it, you could put in a buddy list, you could subscribe to a Sporecast. And also, I think it's still probably the most interesting experiment down a direction that I'm very interested in, which is the idea of asynchronous social gaming.
Asynchronous over time.
Yeah, which means that you've got your own little sandbox, I've got my own sandbox over here, and Farmville almost kind of had aspects of this, where we are communicating, we are sharing stuff back and forth, but we can still sit down and be the god in our own universe. When you get into multiplayer game design, like persistent state worlds and stuff, there's some tremendous design restrictions that come in. First of all, you can't pause the game, you can't cheat, you can't have godlike powers, everybody has to be on the same level treadmill. And so I was trying, build an environment with Spore where somebody actually could be kind of the god in this world, but yet get the benefit of a million other people collaboratively creating the world around you. And I think in that dimension it was incredibly successful. In terms of the amount of content that players created, it wildly exceeded our expectations. We were actually looking at what people have done with The Sims. When we released Creature Creator for Spore, I was hoping to get about 10,000 creatures in the first week on our servers that the players had created. Instead, they passed 1 million creatures in 22 hours. And we passed 100 million creatures in a few months. And so I think right now Spore probably has the largest library of 3D objects, all created by the community in the world. And so I think what we learned in terms of the tools on Spore was remarkable. And in fact, most of the projects I'm pursuing from this point on almost all involve a fairly heavy aspect of crowdsourcing. Because I think crowdsourcing to me is one of the most interesting dynamics that the internet brings to entertainment.
So kind of like the next generation Pixar would be the Stupid Fun Club with crowdsourced interactive.
Yes. Yeah, I think we can right now we're crowdsourcing objects, mods, skins, stuff like that. We're looking at things like crowdsourcing storytelling and world building and a lot of other things. I think that and I've seen other examples of things like this. One of my favorite examples is, how many of you have seen this toy, 20Q? It plays 20 questions. It's a little plastic toy, about 15 bucks. It plays an amazing, kick-ass game of 20 questions. You can think of just the most bizarre thing in the world, ring-tailed ferret, or a lemur, and it'll sit there and figure it out. But it also figures it out in this really alien way. When a human plays 20 questions, they kind of start with, is it, alive or not? Is it this or that? Whereas this thing starts asking, is it slippery? Is it flat? Would a clown eat it? Or, and so it feels like you're interacting with like this alien intelligence. But the way it works is they had a website up for several years where people were playing 20 questions. And if any of you, remember way back in the Apple II days, there was this game called, what's it called? Animals? Animal. It was trying to guess an animal. But basically, if it couldn't guess, and that's the way 20Q works, it asks you, what question would disambiguate what you were thinking of from what I thought it was? And so basically, as people are playing this, every time it loses a game, it's learning from the player how to win the next time. And so basically, over several years, they had millions of people going to this website, training this database how to play the perfect game of 20 questions. And then they just took that database, burned it into a little ROM chip, and sold it for 15 bucks. So it's a great example of how to crowdsource content. And it was also interesting because I would take that and show that to people like my mother or my friends that were not computer savvy at all. And I could show them the most amazing AI program on my computer in the world, and they'd be, oh, okay, that's cool. I hand them this little $10 piece of plastic, and they'd say, that's so smart, that must be a supercomputer. How much did that cost? It was visible intelligence. It was, like in terms of passing the Turing test, the average person thought this thing was really smart. But it wasn't, and in fact, I found this with computers in general. We spent decades trying to get computers to fundamentally recreate human intelligence, and for the most part it failed. But on the other hand, what computers are turning out to be great at is harvesting and distilling human intelligence and redistributing it. When you think about the internet, that's what the internet is. That's what makes Google seem smart. Not that they have this amazing analytic engine back there, but that millions of people are making individual decisions about what page to link to, and Google is harvesting that human intelligence and distilling it into a usable form.
Okay, well, we've got to have some audience questions.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Tag you, so here you got Will Wright, and he can advise you. What's the one specific question you would ask Will Wright when you're put on the spot?
It's not about games actually, but
That's even better.
you were talking about working really hard.
Yes, working really hard.
How has that affected your relationships, your marriages maybe?
Never should get used to.
Well, in fact, we're expecting a child in about 3 weeks here, so this is definitely one of those things. It depends on where you are in your life. I think a lot of the fuel for Silicon Valley in the early games industry were 20-year-olds without families, no kids especially. And in the wife, it came down to how kind of tolerant your wife was with you showing up home late. But like at Maxis, we actually saw, when we started, we were hiring a bunch of 20-year-old single people coming into the company, full of energy and all this. And at some point, Maxis was around for quite a while. Everybody started having kids, et cetera, et cetera. And we noticed it when the crunch times came around, and that's when, and because of the way, just the business structure of the game industry was such that no matter what schedule you're working toward or what the software engineers tell you or whatever, it's always going to slip, which means that as you start slipping, the economic pressures to get it out sooner and sooner just pile up, and the kind of knee-jerk response is to pile more time on it. If we work twice as long, we'll get it out twice as fast. Of course, it doesn't really work, but it's the obvious response. And so it's almost like this whole industry culture, not even within a company. It's not even so much a company culture as an industry culture. There was, you're probably a lot of you familiar with this thing that happened several years ago called EA Spouse. It was this web thread that somebody started. It was a spouse of somebody working at EA, basically kind of putting their hand out for the first time and saying, hey, wait a second, isn't this idiotic? This makes no sense, And all of a sudden everybody piled in, like a rugby match. Oh yeah, you're right. It was like this flash mob online kind of people all of a sudden for the first time acknowledging the fact that this is stupid, And I think that our industry, in a sense, is very healthily recognized that as a problem. And now all you have to do is say EA Spouse to somebody, and then it totally is almost like this intervention thing where, okay, back off.
I'm going to move you along.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I've been told we have a deadline.
What games do you play today?
What games do I play today? Oh gosh. Recently I've been playing Battlefield Bad Company 2 a lot. I've always loved the Battlefield. What's that?
Can I play with you?
Look for
What's your username?
Kitty Puff Puff.
Kitty Puff.
Or yeah, that's my username right
Go
now.
off this side. This guy here.
Yeah.
Ask questions.
Well, just to let you know, I love in online games pretending like I'm a 12-year-old girl that's into Pokemon. And when I come into a game, I just kind of kill these guys, and then my whole persona is a 12-year-old girl playing Pokemon. There's nothing more embarrassing to a 16-year-old guy. Here, go ahead.
About your new company, you said you want to build it more sustainably and things like that.
Yeah.
What other companies are you looking at in terms of examples? Who do you look up to?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about business or what we're actually doing. In terms of what we're doing.
Corporate structure, how you're handing out shares, things like that.
I've actually looked around at a lot of things, and oddly enough, the closest thing I've come to, and I didn't really look at this too closely, but it's Hollywood production companies. That I found to be, that's a model that's been around for quite a while. And these are, groups that come together and they build teams as needed or work with external partners as needed, but they keep their core thing fairly small. In terms of the kind of economics of it, I'm orienting the whole company toward a profit-sharing plan that's very generous, because I don't want to have any connection to Wall Street or stock options, because that's so much of a roll of the dice. Whether your stock options are underwater or sky high, it feels like it's either way up here or way down there. Very improbable that it's somewhere in between that's really kind of safe and probably.
So you get a cut as long as you're an employee, and then.
Well, the way I've structured it is that we have phantom shares, tracking shares that are issued to employees every year. Basically about half of our profits, well in fact all the profits go to the shareholders by that scheme above what our definition of profit is. But the key to it is that people are able to earn that participation even after they leave the company. So that for an 8-year period, because in the kind of thing I'm doing, a lot of the projects somebody might work on might not even make it to market. If you were like work for 2 years on a project and then leave, it still might be in development somewhere and then hit the market a year later, 2 years later. And so I want people to feel like they're participating long term, even if they leave the company. So we basically inflate the share pool 15% every year. So after you've left, your participation just dilutes by about 15% a year. But on the other hand, if our revenue growth is more than 50% a year, you're actually earning more every year after you leave.
How do you manage?
So sorry, got to move it around here.
Yeah.
Quick question.
That's actually pretty smart. Look at FF Series shares as a model for social gaming. We're doing the same thing here. The question is, where do you see cross-platform gaming and social, real-world gaming as the last mile off of the web? Do you see some interesting things in solving larger problems or issues?
Yeah, actually, well, when you say real-world gaming, there are a couple of interpretations of that. One is what I might call socially relevant gaming.
Yeah.
And that's still, I mean, for me, probably the biggest motivation for being in this industry, because I think games really have one of the biggest opportunities for changing the way people think about the world. So, like, one of the projects I'm very invested in is very much down that path, and I'm only doing it because I think it's going to make a big difference in the way people think about the future. And another interpretation of that, though, are how do we build games that, rather than distract people from the world around them, make them appreciate it more. And that's where things like augmented reality I'm finding fascinating. And I don't mean augmented reality in terms of fancy goggles, but more in terms of, you know, smartphones and devices. But, you know, how do you build a game that all of a sudden makes me tune into really interesting aspects of where I am and what I'm doing, rather than pulls me away from it? And that's something that interests me very deeply.
This guy right here.
I had a question about like the whole crunch and burn cycle, where you have crunch time and then afterwards people burn out. Is there really a way out for the industry? And I was wondering if you like.
Is there really what?
Is there a way out for the industry to fix that and not have that anymore?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's almost a culture, an industry-wide culture, that if you're in a studio and it's starting to happen there, in some sense, the peers are not the other people in your company, but the other studios and other game companies around you. And so if you're working at a company that's actually doing that, in some sense, it's kind of employee abuse, really. And I think this is what our industry has begun to kind of recognize, that that should not really be tolerated. I mean, I don't mean to kind of go too far down that path. I mean, because obviously if you're working on a big creative project, and certain people, you know, you really do have to crunch occasionally, but there's definitely a balance to be struck there. And I think it's almost, you know, kind of like the sweatshops, you know, either in third world countries or, you know, youth labor that was happening back, you know, the Industrial Revolution. I think it's something that needs to be seen as kind of a almost a taboo within our industry, and the more the industry as a whole recognizes it. In fact, they've had a lot of groups meeting at GDC and stuff exactly around that issue. And so I think just the awareness of the issue is half the solution.
So this guy in the front here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Moonbot, some of your other more your urban sort of robot social experiments?
Yeah, this is some of the experiments we've done at the Stupid Fun
Repeat the
Club.
question. I don't think.
Yeah, he's asking about this thing called Moonbot that we built at the Stupid Fun Club. So I started the Stupid Fun Club actually several years ago, you know, before leaving EA, as this like side thing. In fact, these are my friends that I did Robot Wars with, and one of the founders was the guy that started Robot Wars, Mark Thorpe, in San Francisco. But we built robots, and we tend to take them out into the world and have them interact with people kind of unpredictably. We'll just have it drive into a restaurant and start talking to people or doing things. We had it go and shoplift to see how they would respond, you know, or buy beer, you know, can it legally buy beer, you know. So we would do this primarily as social experiments, and these were like robots that we kind of built with a lot of off-the-shelf parts, robot platforms, but they had speech recognition. In some cases we were teleoperating them, in some cases they were fully autonomous. But I've always been interested in exploring the way people interact with robots. Robots are interesting as to be distinct from AI, and that robots, you know, can run over your foot and hurt you. And the fact that they're moving around, they have a presence in the environment. I'm really curious because I think, you know, we're moving toward an environment where we're being surrounded by intelligent artifacts all the time, but they sneak up on us. I mean, we take for granted the fact now that our cars talk to us and tell us where to turn, and that we have ATM machines and all these things. But when you stand back and think about it, you know, more and more of what we're surrounded with in our environment are intelligent appliances and machines. And so I'm always curious how people relate to these things. You know, do they want to treat them as, you know, appliances or pets or friends, washing machines? And we found just like really interesting principles, you know, just in all these kind of interactions, basically social experiments. Men typically go in and before a man will even interact with the robot, he wants to know, is it male or female? You know, which is kind of a meaningless question, right? Women never ask that. It's just the men. And they cannot relate to this thing unless they know whether they're relating to a female or a male persona. Women always come up and they've always got a million great ideas on how to improve it. You know? Whereas the men might want to know how it works, but they don't really want to improve it. You know? These are like just general principles we've discovered over the years, you know, kind of doing these experiments.
This guy here.
I heard you were working on a TV show.
Yeah.
So with these robot experiments and the TV show, are you less interested in games now?
No, I'm actually more interested in how we take games wider out into the world. Because, you know, we kind of had games over here as a separate little pile, and games were only played by a very specific subset of our population. Games were something that, you know, 15-year-old boys played, or 10-year-old girls, you know, depending on whatever. But they weren't something that were infused in our culture everywhere. When you think of storytelling, you know, we have movies, we have books, but also storytelling appears everywhere. You know, it's really infused all around us in almost everything we do. I think games are in the process of slowly doing that. I think games are kind of in this, what I call Cambrian explosion right now. They're going through this tremendously wonderful period of diversification, especially demographically. The people that are playing the game and why they're playing them is just wonderful. I think the industry is probably healthier than I've ever seen it. You know, and I think that, you know, 10 years ago, everybody was worried that games would become kind of like comic books, this kind of niche thing that kind of slowly died off because it became very insular. So that's why I think what's happening right now is very exciting. And so when I'm working in other things like television, what I'm really doing is I'm saying, how much can we take from crowdsourcing, from game social dynamics, from community dynamics? Because I think games also have been at the forefront of building communities. And so I think that what we're learning in terms of community building in games, I haven't seen any other media really embrace that to the degree that I think it could be happening right now.
So these are great questions and a lot of pressure. You got to keep this pace up here. This fellow right back in the middle here.
Yeah, can you comment a little bit about the economics of game development versus kind of the traditional big company versus some of the newer companies doing like online social gaming?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we're kind of in a really uncomfortable position right now, but I think it's pretty temporary. Well, the model used to be that you'd have to invest $10 million in a AAA title at some big
20,
game,
30.
or 20, 30. Okay, well, don't ask how much Spore costs. But and then you know, if you were successful, you'd get 100 million back or 200 million back. But you know, basically roll the dice every time. And if you rolled a 6, you'd get that 100 million back, 200 million back. If you rolled a 4 or a 3, you might break even. Anything less than that, and you're bust. So you basically need to be a big enough company to be able to roll that dice 5 or 10 times a year to guarantee that you get at least 1 to 6 on there, right? Now, because of all these new niches opening up, not just platforms, but distribution methods. You know, we've been talking about digital distribution for the last 10 years, but now it's finally happening. And that typically happens with all these things where there's kind of this long curve, and then it does that. And so we're that on the digital distribution side. So opportunities are now opening up where people can distribute like little games on Xbox Arcade or the web or wherever. And so there are people that are actually making real money on, you know, their Facebook games, their iPhone games, their, you know, Xbox Arcade games. It's just, you know, still a very small percentage of the people in those markets. But those markets are kind of a rising tide, I think, relative to these giant studio bets, you know. And so even the big publishers like Electronic Arts are getting much more leery about investing $10, $20 million in a title unless it's an absolutely well-known franchise like The Sims, where it's totally predictable. I think you're going to see most of the interesting new IP being launched in things like social gaming, iPhone, mobile gaming, stuff like that. I think that's where you're going to see the interesting risks.
Believe in the future. This guy here.
I wanted to know what your thoughts were on, no pun intended, but thought-integrated games with something like the emotive headset.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Things like
So
that.
repeat that question.
The question is my thoughts on these. Basically, there are these devices now that kind of read your brain waves. Fairly cheap devices now. And in fact, in the toy market, one of the big hits this season was the Force toy, which basically had the technology where you put this thing on and you use your mind to move this pink, you know, ball up and down. These technologies are interesting. In fact, these games have been around quite a long time. There have been biofeedback games, you know, from 15 years ago, where you would basically fly a balloon over hills and stuff by relaxing, and then getting tense again and relaxing. It had interesting kind of side feedback. Is that you're about to crash into the mountain, you get really tense, but you have to relax for the balloon to go up. So it's almost kind of the opposite feedback. But I think that, you know, you have to kind of look at that in context of all the other input devices, because I think, you know, the Wii, you know, had the attitude sensing, etc. We have, of course, you know, the multi-touch interfaces that are becoming more common. So I think for the first time, and this is part of the giant diversification that's happening, for the longest time, games had pretty much the same input device. As the graphics and the output were getting better and better. If you look at the early computer games, it was a few pixels on screen, but you had a keyboard and a joystick, maybe a mouse. Later, we had these incredible high-res graphics, screens, but we still had basically a keyboard, a joystick, and a mouse as input. But now, for the first time, we're increasing the bandwidth back into the computer. We had been, basically turning up the bandwidth coming out of the computer, but the bandwidth of what you could put back into the computer was very low, especially the effective bandwidth. Whereas you hand somebody a Wii remote and say, play tennis, and they instinctively kind of know how to swing a tennis racket, but also the data rate going back to the computer is pretty high. So things like this brain device, I think is just part of a larger trend of having more interesting input devices. And in fact, now, moving to things like cameras, like Project Natal from Microsoft, which is really kind of an expansion of like the Sony iToy. A lot of it is going to be the intelligence behind these devices. We can always capture a good image on a robot, but how do you process that is the question.
Okay, I'm going to do 3 more questions. This gentleman here, you had a question?
Oh, yeah. A lot of my friends played SimCity just to watch it get eaten by Godzilla. Yeah. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the industry's view on emergent gameplay in sandboxes.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask what my view was on the Godzilla attack. I think that emergent gameplay has turned out to be kind of the trump card. And I think you can look at almost any popular game, even in established genres. Things like Grand Theft Auto, if you actually look at what people are doing in Grand Theft Auto, they're experimenting with the emergence of that game. Grand Theft Auto has a very simple physics engine, very simple behavioral engine, etc. And it's the cool interactions, the emergence that happens between these very simple engines that makes the game incredibly fun to explore again and again and again. So I think emergence is almost like the secret sauce that almost the best games all kind of share, whether it's turn-based like Civilization or something real-time like Grand Theft Auto. What was it you asked about emergence and one other thing?
Just sandboxes.
Oh, sandbox games, yeah. I think the creativity side of it, that was one of the first hooks that we really saw that started bringing females into gaming for the very first time. And I think The Sims was a really good example of that, where we had these people that really the creative experience was the interesting part for them. It was nice that there was some amount of game, some amount of pushback, some challenge in the game, so that whatever they built in the creative experience had some meaning, it had a context to put it into. But primarily, I think it was a creative expression. It was really interesting when I saw The Sims evolve for a lot of people. For in fact, most of the players, they kind of evolves from a gameplay experience where they're trying to make money, succeed in the game, to a creative experience where they now start telling stories, making machinima, sharing skins, and it becomes part of their identity. So for them, it's almost like writing. In terms of the stories that they tell with it. It's just a different kind of format to communicate in.
So, Ian from Trumpet here.
So I just have a question about game design. Like, how do you balance designing for yourself, like the stuff that you like to play, versus designing for others, like what you suspect others may like?
Well, I usually really get focused on the theme and the topic first, and that's what usually draws me in. And what I'll do, whatever the topic might be, maybe it's ants, and I'll just go around to random people for a year and bug the hell out of them by bringing up ants in every conversation. And I'll get a sense of how they think about ants. I hate ants. Ants creep me out. Or, ants are stupid, or whatever it is. And I'll experiment with different ways of, aren't ants cool because of X, or look at that ant, what's he doing, It's interesting, when you get 100 people triangulating, how they feel about that topic, you start intuiting an interesting way to present it. And also, what would it occur to them to do with an ant? Do they want to pull out a magnifying glass, or do they want to build an ant colony? So for me, it's almost more anthropological. Or sociological, in terms of, I start with a theme, I interact with a lot of people around that theme and get a sense of, in their imagination, how would they engage that topic? And it could be that they have absolutely no interest and I go on to another topic, but I tend to focus on topics that I think have universal appeal, to like a 5-year-old or a grandparent. And then work my way in from there and basically then figure out what the handles are on that topic. How can I present a topic to somebody in an interesting way to where all of a sudden they want to grab it and engage with it. And then, much deeper into the experience, do I actually get into things like gameplay dynamics and that kind of stuff. So I'm very much kind of starting almost on the cognitive wrapper around what I want to present and work my way toward the game dynamics.
One more question from this gentleman right here.
Do you consider life a game?
Do I consider life a game? Yeah, actually I consider everything a game. I mean, I think games are more fundamental than storytelling, for instance. I think you can look at any really young kid and they are playing games. Play is something that we are inherently kind of, it's built into us. And in fact, I think play and storytelling are both educational technologies. I think they are both ways for us to build schema and models in our imagination based on experiences that we've never really had. games are basically toy experiences that we can have in kind of toy form. Story is experience that's transferred from somebody else. That maybe they never even had it, maybe it's a fictional experience, but basically I can learn from other people's stories, or I can learn from playing with, sand on a beach. But they're both ways for us to build more effective models of the world.
So, I don't know if you guys have figured this out. There's some people that aren't actually in the school. I can tell there's some gentlemen that are older than even maybe as old as I am. And but that was incredible. That was like 30 years of experience. Well, 20 years of experience in game design.
10 years, yeah.
I'm declining every year.
Yeah.
So that was really amazing. Now I'm going to hand it back to Eli here, and he's going to ask the actual last question. Eli?
Okay, that's actually a lot of stress, but okay, last question, and don't leave. We're going to have a few notes before things break out. What do you think, like, on Live and O-Toy, these companies that essentially let you play games on really dumb devices, what will that do for the game industry?
Well, I think the game industry, what's interesting about it is that it's getting more and more platform agnostic. In terms of the way we make games, the kind of games we design, for me as a designer, I care less and less about the specific platform. And I'm thinking more about games that work cross-platform pretty nicely. In fact, I think most interesting games have aspects of them on different platforms. So there's like a social aspect, there might be a very high graphic immersive aspect, there might be a mobile aspect. So I think the really big franchises in the future are going to be thought of as this like octopus with tendrils going out in different directions, which means that something like OnLive is one potential opportunity. It's one tentacle that you can choose to deploy. But I think less and less you see really big games being designed specifically for that platform. And I think that I might be able to put a game on the Nintendo DS, but if I basically make my game absolutely reliant on the fact that I have two screens, and a touch input, I'm pretty much stuck in that little gulag, right? So I really don't want to think that way in terms of a designer. So I think these are opportunities, but I don't think that they're anything more than an expansion of the possibilities.
Good.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.